Michael, do you have affirmative arguments for why atheism is a more legitimate worldview?
Yes, there are four that I think are quite interesting. First of all, I would argue that atheism is the default position. That's based upon the idea that when you survey the alternatives, you have a large number of equally likely alternatives, and theism is only one of those. A second argument focuses upon the sorts of minds that we're acquainted with, right? And I think there's good evidence that in the case of human beings and other animals, the mind is the brain, there's no immaterial substance, right? And so there's an argument from that to the conclusion it's unlikely that God exists. A third argument, the one I think is most important, is the argument from evil, which focuses upon suffering and deaths of innocent people in the world and argues that the existence of God is unlikely. And then finally, there's an argument from the hiddenness of God. And it says basically that the existence of God is much less evident than it could be. And that's not a good thing, and that provides us with a reason for concluding that God does not exist.
All right, let's talk about each one of them. Let's start with number one, that all societies, it seems, has some sort of an innate sense of a spiritual world. So why with that cultural history do you have atheism as the default position?
Because there are alternatives that seem to be on a par. I mean, compare, for example, the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good being, the God of monotheism, with an all-powerful, all-knowing, but perfectly evil being, and with the alternative of all-powerful, all-knowing, but morally indifferent deity. I would say that those three are equally likely, right? But if that's right, then you pick any one of them, the probability has to be no greater than 1/3. I mean, you look at the world, it's very mixed, so that it seems to me both the idea of a perfectly good deity and a perfectly evil deity are really very problematic, and you should think that there's a deity who doesn't really care about good and evil.
Or that deity has a very complex and rich understanding far beyond our understanding of what this complex amalgam of good and evil is and what an end result is.
Well, that gets us into another argument. That's going to get into the argument from evil, right? I think there's some bad things in the world. I don't know what you think, okay, right? But I think the Holocaust was not a great idea, okay? I think the tsunamis that killed, I think around 300,000 people in India, that was not a good idea, okay, right? And so there are things that I think that you and I would change or prevent if we had the knowledge and power to do so. Then the idea is it's reasonable to conclude that any being that allows that is not morally perfect.
I think to make sense out of that argument, you have to add something after death.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that if humans don't survive death, then there's no hope at all of answering the argument from evil, right? But I think even if they do, it's deeply problematic, okay? If you consider, for example, children who are tortured and suffer enormously, right? The question is, what reason could there be for allowing that to happen? And simply saying, that after death things are going to be made better doesn't seem to me to be a satisfactory answer. I mean,
certainly so, but this is part of the world as it exists. There'll be some recompense, some justice in the world to come. I mean, that's the only way to give the argument consistency.
Yes, that's absolutely right. But I mean, I was saying that even if you have those sorts of goals,
it's still not good enough for you.
Not good enough. The world can still be different and achieve those goals more effectively.
Okay, let's go to number 4, the hiddenness of God.
So the starting point of the argument is to, first of all, to say that the existence of God could be much more evident than what it is, and then to argue that it'd be a good thing if the existence of God were more evident than what it is.
But wouldn't that create a very rote, mechanistic society where God was so prevalent and so certain that everybody would have the same happy smile on their face?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you're maybe thinking of a very heavy-handed God, right, who's going to be on top of you all the time. But I think there'd be tremendous scope for individuality, and people could develop or not develop in various ways, okay?
I respect you very much, and you don't believe in God. And so, from my point of view, is that your fault or God's fault? I mean, your point is that it's God's fault. He could have made himself less hidden.
That's right, yeah. I mean, like a lot of people argue, in effect, that people intentionally blind themselves, or intentionally turn themselves in the face of God and so on. I think what's going on here is the idea that if there's a God, we'll know that there's a moral law and so on that's enforced, right? And so there's certain things we will not get away with, right? And the argument seems to be that, you have more trouble, committing adultery and so on, right? Now, if you say, which would you prefer, a world where you can commit adultery without someone, punishing you, right? Or a world where you have a chance to live forever, right? That's an easy choice, right? Yeah. So the idea that people intentionally blind themselves to the existence of God seems to be very implausible, right?
Okay, Michael, 4 arguments why God does not exist. Which is the big one?
The argument for evil, definitely.
And I haven't asked you this. Are you an atheist or agnostic?
I'm an atheist. I think the existence of God is very unlikely.
Very unlikely, but I don't hear 0.
No, I'm happy it's not 0, but it's very low indeed.